Okay, guys, so we're going to talk about behavioral psychology, but specifically Skinner versus Pavlov, because I have noticed that you guys have had a lot of trouble kind of distinguishing the difference between the two. So first is the basic definition of behavioral psychology, which we obviously have talked about. But behavioral psychology is the sector of psychology that focuses on the understanding of the behavior of humans and animals, with the assumption that all behaviors are either reflexes produced by a response to something in the environment or a consequence of a person's history, which would be things like reinforcement or punishment. This does not take into account things like emotion and motives. Obviously, that's a whole different field of psychology, which we'll talk about in a separate unit. Now, some of the same famous behavioral psychologists that we have talked about are obviously James B. Watson, who had the experiment with little Albert, the one that was probably not going to be very much so allowed now, but at the time was totally fine. Ivan Pavlov, who we will talk about, B.F. Skinner, who we will also talk about, and Edward Thorndike, who had the experiment with the cats. It's kind of easy to remember a lot of these famous behavioral psychologists just kind of based on what they used in their experiments, which is why I have the in parentheses of what they did. So obviously for our goal, we are trying to make sure that you guys understand the difference between Pavlov and Skinner, because there's clearly some confusion within the class about it. So even Ivan Pavlov, you always have to think of dogs. His entire study was based around his dogs, and he was also the first to introduce the concept of conditioning through his experiment with his animals. So obviously we've talked about this before, but his experiment was with dogs. Pavlov realized that his dogs were salivated naturally when they were brought food. Due to the response being natural, the animals were displaying an unconditioned response, which was drooling, to an unconditioned stimulus, which was food. Just like the picture shows up at the top. So Pavlov began to ring the bell whenever he would bring the dogs their food. And so they would eventually, with more of this happening, start to salivate or drool prior to even having the food there. And obviously Pavlov manipulated this in a couple different ways, but this was kind of the main gist of his experiment. He had turned the drooling into a conditioned stimulus for these dogs. And then you move to B.F. Skinner, who was with the rats. Always think of the rats. Skinner is most well known for developing the theory of operant conditioning, which again we've talked about before. So his experiment was a little bit different. Skinner made use first of positive and negative reinforcement. His positive reinforcement would increase the behavior he desired. In this case, it was for the rat to push on a pedal, which would in turn give him food, and he would continue to perform this behavior, obviously. He used negative reinforcement, which was basically taking away a punishment like getting shocked if the rat would perform whatever he wanted. So if the rat pushed on the lever, then it would relieve the punishment of being shocked. So obviously, those are just like very, very simple definitions of what these different men did. But obviously the big difference between the two, even though they worked with a similar concept, was the animals, which, like I said, always think of the animals. Pavlov was dogs and Skinner was rats. Now they were also doing, what they were doing was different as well. Pavlov obviously was working with the concept of conditioning based on the stimulus that he was producing, whereas Skinner was working with the concept of reinforcement and punishment, which was different than what Pavlov was doing. Skinner was kind of punishing the animals, whereas Pavlov was just introducing different stimuli. So obviously the takeaway from this is, while both Skinner and Pavlov are considered some of the best behavioral psychologists and their studies were very similar, they were not the same. They used different animals and they had completely different concepts, although they do sound extremely similar. They were both, however, extremely influential in behavioral psychology and very much so helpful in working on the theories still tested today. So I hope that kind of helps. We're going to talk more about this in class, obviously, just to make sure you really, really understand the difference. But this is also a video that I think can help that I had presented to me by another teacher. And those are the citations. So I hope this has helped.